Good afternoon, everyone. My name's John Tillman. I'm the director of Atlas Network Center for the U.S. and Canada. And I want to welcome all of you to this interview with the winner of the third annual North American Liberty Award, the Mercatus Center, for their work at the Equity Initiative for American Healthcare. The annual North American Liberty Award is awarded to the think tank in our network that has the most measurable success and advancements to human flourishing in the United States and Canada in the past year. The winner receives a $30,000 prize to continue their good work. The North American Liberty Award is made possible and is generously sponsored by the Templeton Religion Trust. With me today is Matt Mitchell. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
We're glad you're here, Matt, and this is a great topic that has real impact on people's lives. Matt, for all of you watching, is a senior research fellow and director of the Equity Initiative at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. In Matt's writing and research, he specializes in public choice economics and the economics of government favoritism toward businesses, industries, and occupations. You know the old thing about picking winners and losers. Matt has testified before the U.S. Congress and has advised several state and local government policymakers on both fiscal and regulatory policies. His research has been featured in numerous national media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, National Public Radio. At this point, we would usually go yada, yada, yada. But today, there's actually a great piece by the Institute for Justice and mentioning Matt's work and the Mercatus Center's work on this very topic. So be sure to see that today. The Mercatus Center has been researching, disseminating their findings on Certificate of Need requirements since 2014. Certificate of Need, otherwise known as CON laws, force private healthcare providers to seek approval from state regulators to expand or purchase new equipment. Originally implemented in the 1960s and 70s to try to prevent to limit competition, I should say, in healthcare and to prevent wasteful spending, CON laws have resulted in fewer healthcare services with lower quality and higher prices. All of us could have, of course, predicted that. The Mercatus Center is winning this award for their work to remove these barriers to free enterprise and prosperity. Matt, I don't think there's ever been an acronym quite as good as CON to describe Certificate of Need. Perhaps the only competitor was CREEP back in 1972, which stood for the Committee to Re-elect the President, Richard Nixon. But CON is pretty well named. Tell us a little bit about what CON is and why it's such a problem.
Yeah, they're definitely losing the marketing war, that's for sure. So it's a weird law, first of all, just to sort of point out the obvious. It's in the vast majority of markets, if an entrepreneur wants to open or expand a product or a service, they just do so, and they assess need based on their expectation that they'll earn a profit. But in 35 or 37 states, depends on how you count them, if you are an entrepreneur who wants to open or expand a healthcare facility, you have to go and ask for permission to do so. And what's strange about it is, unlike other types of regulations like occupational licensure or inspections of restaurants or something like that, the regulators don't even have a pretense to be aiming for the public's health or safety. They're not going to inquire as to the provider's competency or their safety record or their cleanliness or anything like that. They're simply there to second guess the provider's belief that the community needs the product or service. So it's a very unusual type of rule. And then perhaps what's most controversial about it is if you're a regulator or if you're a provider and you're trying to obtain a CON, of course you can spend tens, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can spend years trying to obtain this. But what's really galling is that you'll go before a regulator who may actually have your competitors sitting on the board. And if they don't, then your competitors are invited to come in and offer their arguments as to why, all things considered, they would prefer not to have any competition. So it's often sometimes called a competitor's veto law, because it really puts people in a position to be able to say, no, I don't really want any competition.
That'd be a little like asking Home Depot to determine whether or not Ace Hardware should show up next door, right? It's really a bizarre mindset, and it really does show the statist desires of regulators to really control access to healthcare and keep it all sort of contained. What I think is really interesting about this, Matt, is the human cost of this. So far, we've talked about it somewhat in the abstract public policy, but let's talk about how this actually changes people's lives for the better or worse. What happens to actual people when the CON laws restrict access to healthcare because they're limiting supply?
Yeah. So, we can rattle off the numbers, and the numbers themselves are pretty compelling. Patients in states that have con laws relative to patients in states without con laws, they have access to 30% fewer hospitals. They have access to 15% fewer ambulatory surgery centers. They have access to fewer rural hospitals and rural ambulatory surgery centers. There are fewer dialysis clinics, fewer hospice care facilities. There are fewer hospital beds, fewer MRI machines, CT scanners, PET scans. There's a greater racial disparity in the provision of care in con states relative to non-con states. And I find those numbers compelling. But what I also find really compelling, and most humans connect with actual real world stories, and there are very sad stories. Probably one of the most ridiculous is a few years ago in Southwest Virginia, a hospital system called Lewis Gale had applied to Virginia to obtain a con for a neonatal intensive care unit. So this is a specialized unit for taking care of premature babies, and they were denied. The con regulator said, you don't need that service in your community. A few months later, a woman showed up at the hospital. She was in premature labor. She had the baby and there were complications. They couldn't take care of the baby because they'd been denied a con for an NICU unit. So they asked the nearest hospital that did have a con for a NICU unit to send over an ambulance. They didn't have a con for an ambulance, so they had to ask for the ambulance as well. And tragically, the baby died before the ambulance could arrive. Now, who knows whether the baby would have survived or if they had a con, but this is what's remarkable, is the next year, that same hospital facility asked for another con. And they said, look, they told the story. They said, we need it. Somebody showed up in our hospital in need of care, and they were still denied.
Well, when you hear a story like that, which is just heartbreaking, it really makes you go crazy. How can these people be so cold-hearted? Who is on these boards and making these decisions?
Well, in many cases, they are people who are already in the industry, so it's quite common for hospital executives to serve on the board. Sometimes they have physicians on the board, although that's interesting because the largest physicians association, the American Medical Association, it has been convinced by the data that con laws do not protect consumers. But they're often dominated really by the industry themselves, and the legislature really has the ear, or the hospital associations have the ear of the legislature, so they listen to them. And unfortunately, those who are really harmed by this typically don't even know that these rules exist.
So you have some hospitals that are trying to protect their more or less monopoly control of a market, but then you have other competitors, either new competitors, new entrants, or an existing one that wants to expand their services, add equipment. So they're sort of on both sides of this, aren't they, depending on whether they're trying to expand or ward off expansion of others?
Yes, so what we find is that existing hospitals are not particularly constrained by these laws. It's new hospitals and hospital substitutes like ambulatory surgery centers that really have the hardest time obtaining certificates of need. And that sort of makes sense because we know that there are what economists would call economies of scale in regulatory compliance. Once you hire, a person or two or three people that are dedicated to regulatory affairs and dealing with the government and obtaining these certificates of need, you've got that sort of fixed cost taken care of, and a very large hospital has an easier time handling those costs. But a small provider, they can't compete. It's very, very difficult for them to figure out how to navigate this system.
This happened in Illinois some years ago. There was an applicant to have a proton cancer treatment center within maybe an hour and a half of an existing facility in DuPage that was part of the DuPage Hospital's operation. Of course, they opposed it. And in the first vote, it was turned down. And I happen to have a relationship with somebody that was trying to get this certificate approved. And what was interesting about it is that the travel area, they didn't seem to have any empathy at all that under the current situation with only one provider, patients getting cancer treatment who are going through all kinds of terrible things in their life while they're trying to survive cancer. They have to spend an extra 3 hours every time they go and get treatment to drive to this more distant facility. The regulators didn't have any empathy for that at all. The new facility, of course, being closer to many of the patients that had been going to the existing facility. These kind of things are going on all the time, I assume, all over the country, stories like that, and of course, worse, like the ones you told earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, there's another story. A few years ago, there was a radiologist in Virginia who wanted to open a clinic that would offer virtual colonoscopies. And they're basically what they sound like. It's a colonoscopy, but it's not as invasive. They use CT scanners to do a virtual scan. And this is a situation
That
where...
sounds like a brilliant idea, Matt.
Yes, exactly. Especially for those of us who are approaching that age where we're supposed to be getting those. So, yeah, they, 50% of at-risk people do not obtain scans. And yet this is a disease, colon cancer, that has a 90% treatment rate if you get it. And 50,000 people die every year from colon cancer. So getting a virtual colonoscopy just makes a lot of sense. He asked for permission to enter the market, and he was denied. And the reason that they gave is, sorry, there's already CT scanners in use in Northern Virginia. Now, it didn't matter to them, apparently, that these CT scanners were not being used for virtual colonoscopies.
Amazing, really amazing. Talk a little bit about the scope of the kind of things that come under these certificate of need, the con job type of regulations. What's all involved here? How broad is the purview of these?
So it really varies from state to state. Some states require a con for just a few things. Other states, Vermont, Hawaii, they require cons for dozens and dozens of technologies and procedures. But it can be anything from a new hospital wing, to, I already mentioned, a neonatal intensive care unit. If you want to buy a hospital bed in many states, you need a con. One of the things that I find, one of the things I find pretty amazing is how often it specifically limits procedures that are aimed at helping those who are least vulnerable among us. So there are a lot of states, more than a dozen states, that require cons for as I said, neonatal intensive care units, but also psychiatric care facilities, facilities for those with mental health issues, for facilities for drug abuse treatment. It's really amazing that in this day and age, we actually think that it's wise to restrict the supply of drug and substance abuse facilities. That's not, it's totally out of sync with what everybody's knows is a significant problem in the United States.
Did we see a difference in the treatment successes, if you will, during the COVID crisis in states that have certificate of need requirements versus those states that don't? Do we have enough data or information to evaluate whether there's a material difference in how COVID has been handled state by state?
Yeah, we do. So we were curious about that question, of course, as soon as COVID hit. And so we looked at what are the projections in terms of hospital bed shortages, and do those correlate in any way with con laws? And we found absolutely they do. States are twice as likely to experience shortages in ICU beds in states that require a con for an ICU bed. And these shortages are much, much larger on a per capita basis. It's orders of magnitude larger in a con state relative to a non-con state. There's also recent research just came out by some scholars at University of Connecticut and elsewhere, where they found that those states that suspended their con laws temporarily, I think about 24 states did so, actually had better outcomes in terms of death rates during the COVID crisis. So the early evidence seems to suggest that the con is limiting our ability to fight COVID.
So literally lives have been saved by the suspension of those con laws, and that should be good evidence to go forward and try to continue this reform effort that you've been on. Matt, how did you become interested in this? Where did your curiosity about all of this start?
Hmm. Well, I am interested in public policy that's discriminatory in nature, that favors certain business models over others or certain businesses over others. And like many people who first hear about con laws, I think I had the reaction that this can't really be a thing. There's no way that this exists.
It's so
I grew
stupid. How could this be?
Yeah, yeah. I grew up in New Mexico, a relatively low income rural state, and thankfully we don't have certificate of need laws here. So it just sort of seemed like a foreign concept to me. But so once I learned about it, we were just really interested in the anti-competitive effects and this sort of favoritism. And it turns out, my dissertation advisor was Thomas Stratman, and he's now a good friend and colleague at the Mercatus Center, and he's one of the best econometricians. I'm biased, but I think he's one of the best econometricians in the country. He was really eager to dig into this, and the topic lends itself to study in many ways because when you talk to state legislators, they often say, we just don't know. We can't imagine what would happen in our state if we got rid of con laws. So it's so risky. And what I always try to tell them and reassure them is say, actually we have a pretty good sense. Not only do we have centuries of economic theory, but we've got 30, 40 years of data here. So it turns out that about 40% of the US population, like me, lives in a state without a certificate of need law. These are urban states, rural states, coastal, intercontinental. They have all sorts of different mixes of populations and demographics. We can see what's going on with those populations that are in the 40% of states without con laws versus the populations that are in the 60% of states with con laws. We can control for other factors, demographics and socioeconomic factors, and see what's going on in outcomes. And really across the board, we find the con laws restrict access, diminish the quality of care, and raise costs. So it really, the data is just extremely compelling here in my view. So I love the idea of being able to share some of what we have learned with public policymakers.
It sounds to me like when you have these conversations with legislators who are making the decisions as to whether to repeal a con law, or I suppose there's not anybody really trying to advance one these days. These are somewhat established, and really the fight is over repeal. Is that correct?
You'd be surprised. Every so often, it's the other way around. But yes, go on.
No kidding. Okay, it's okay. The people who like to live, the Luddites are still around. Who's on the other side of this negotiation? When you're talking to that legislator and you walk out of the room, who's sitting out in the chair waiting to come in and tell them that you're wrong and that they should continue with the con job?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's not who is sitting out in the chair; it's who is sitting in the chairs. A few years ago, I testified. Actually, it was just last year, I testified in Florida. And there's essentially me. Sometimes there's somebody from the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission. They've taken the position that con laws are anti-competitive for decades, whether they were under control by Democrats or Republicans. But then on the other side, there are chairs and chairs full of hospital executives who have horror stories that they want to tell you about what would happen if we repealed the con laws. Now, the horror stories, I should point out, are not really based on data or good theory. They're just speculation. They are, if we open up healthcare to competition, they say, we'll have so much competition that all hospitals will go away. Well, that doesn't comport with anything that we find. If we open up hospitals to competition, then we won't have care for low-income populations. Again, that doesn't show up in the data. If we open hospitals to competition, we'll have lower quality care. Well, the data don't support that either. But these are people that interact with legislators on a regular basis. They know them well. They are well-heeled. We have evidence that PAC contributions does correlate with your odds of winning a con. And so our view is that those who are harmed by this are consumers and taxpayers who typically don't even know that these rules exist. But they're so numerous and they're not well organized. We sort of view our mission as representing those who don't have representation in the legislature.
This is a bit of the dilemma of the concentrated benefits for the hospitals and dispersed costs for patients and the public that are not aware of it. There's no really easy organizing mechanism, if not for you and Mercatus. In fact, a lot of this work and others that have worked on an Institute for Justice, and there's people around the country, but you guys have certainly taken a leading role in this. If you weren't doing this work, and along with the others I've mentioned, this quasi-monopoly control harming people would just continue unabated, I assume.
Well, that's our theory. Yeah, you're absolutely right on the concentrated benefits and diffuse cost piece of it. It's when you're small and few in number, it's very easy to get organized. But those who are numerous just have a real uphill battle in trying to organize. And you're right to point out, there are other really wonderful institutions, Illinois Policy Institute, many Atlas network members, the Institute for Justice, the Goldwater Institute, that are bringing to bear a lot of tools that Mercatus doesn't bring to bear. There's public interest litigation firms that are on the ground filing court case, taking court cases under state anti-competitive laws that are trying to eliminate these things. So it's really definitely a group effort.
Have you ever looked into putting together a conference of all the people involved in this work and getting everybody together to talk about different ways to create synergy and higher leverage?
We have, and there's certainly great opportunities created by organizations like the State Policy Network and others, but we sort of have an informal network at this point where we're constantly on the phone with our friends at IJ and Goldwater and others.
Oh, spontaneous order, amazing.
Yes.
There was nobody from Central Command that told you to do that, right? You just came up with that all on your own. That's pretty good. It's amazing how it works. What do you think, when you look back at these laws and how they've affected people's lives, what do you think some of the worst aspects of these laws are? How has it played out? You told us a couple stories already of some of the negative consequences. What else have you seen where this really creates hardship for people or the public?
Well, so much of it is unseen, and that's part of the problem. The great French economist Frederick Bastiat pointed out that a good economist will look not just only at the seen but the unseen. And here, the unseen effects are very prevalent, and we're trying to uncover those and make them a little bit more obvious to people. But if you show up at a hospital that doesn't have a neonatal intensive care unit, you don't know that that's because of the con law or not because of the con law. The data suggests that the con laws certainly play a role in that. But what I worry about is all those people who have less access to care and don't even know that they have less access to care. Right. And I would also point out, particularly when a lot of this is harming vulnerable populations, as I mentioned before, that's something that just really I find personally galling.
Well, I think that's one of the, especially in this day and age with all that's going on in the country, the way this harms vulnerable people or poor people the most is really interesting. People who have resources or really good insurance have ways to get around these restrictions. They're always going to find the best possible. The whole idea of medical tourism is an example of that, right? Where it's on steroids, where people are seeking the very best care because they can afford it. And meanwhile, who's left holding the bag of a restrictive policy like this are the most vulnerable. It seems to me from a political point of view, in terms of course, obviously doing policy work within the C3 framework, but nevertheless, it's a political decision for a legislator whether or not to get on board with reforming these laws. A pretty compelling case could be made about how discriminatory it is against the poor, disadvantaged, and minorities. Have you had any conversations like that with legislators? Is that a topic? Is that an area of opportunity to create some legislative leverage?
Yeah, definitely. And I mentioned the research that found that con laws seem to have a disparate impact on African American communities relative to other communities. And that's, by the way, a pretty consistent finding. Economics is, we have these clean diagrams that show if you have a supply restriction, you're going to have a smaller quantity of a product or service. But what that obscures is who is actually denied the product or service. And it's pretty consistent that it tends to be lower income populations, often populations that don't live close to hospitals or in major metropolises where they have access to that. So those are the ones who are most likely to be, certainly.
For the people watching us chat about this, how can they be helpful to you? What can they do to be helpful? Is it identifying these stories, paying attention to these sorts of things when they happen, and sending information your way?
That would definitely be helpful. I mean, I try to follow the Milton Friedman rule of when you're presenting a policymaker with information, give them the data and give them an anecdote, because humans remember the anecdotes sometimes more than the data. So, the old story that 1,000 deaths is a statistic, but one death, that's a real tragedy.
Right.
If you are aware of specific instances in your communities, please let us know. Anything from people being denied cons to stories of some of the hardships that providers have and the hoops that they've had to go through to obtain cons. Those stories are very, very helpful and compelling. And then, examples of con boards overreaching. A minute ago, we talked about, how in most cases, the ball seems to be moving towards reform, and thankfully that is true. But every so often you find sort of a crazy example in Michigan. Just this winter, the con regulator moved to regulate CAR T therapy, which is a cutting edge, very exciting cancer therapy. It's been approved by the FDA. At the time, it was only approved for patients who had tried other types of therapies and that hadn't worked. And this was really their last best hope. And Michigan's con board said, we don't think we want this in Michigan, or at least we don't want it. We want a restricted supply and make sure that only major providers offer it. Well, that was an instance where they overreached. And actually the state legislature pushed back on the con regulator and revoked that rule. But those types of stories, we become aware of those stories and can publicize it. And thankfully, in that instance, we actually had a piece in the Wall Street Journal talking about it. Another one in a Detroit paper. We find out about these stories because of our friends in the community. So please let us know if you know of stories like that. We'd love to write about it and publicize it.
Have you ever looked into, I always like detective stories and sort of try to get to the root source of how something happens. So that story you just told is interesting to me. I think what would be really interesting is to do a Freedom of Information request for all the emails between them and some of the hospital incumbents and others who feel that this particular service might be a threat to their current services they're providing, and look to see if there's an email trail where this idea of regulating that new innovation was planted by a competitor. Have you ever looked into doing that sort of thing? Or
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And again, kind of going back to the idea that there's a lot of great organizations that are doing work in this area. I mentioned some of the public interest litigation firms, but Eric Boehm at Reason has done some really great investigative journalism pieces. He's the one who really dug into and explored the story of the Lewis Gale incident in Southwest Virginia. I would suggest any enterprising public investigative journalists, that would be a wonderful story for them to dig into.
Yeah, in fact, so we'll put that call out to everybody watching. If you're in that, looking for a hot subject, I'll bet if we started having people FOIA every single state and all the communications of people on the board of the con board, I bet we'll find some interesting email traffic between those members and incumbents trying to protect market share. Because as much as we love the profit motive, what we like is an open, free market for anybody to pursue those profits, because we know that profits are virtuous. But when those profits are protected by the government in the way that you're describing here, those hospitals are trying to protect their positive cash flow by reducing the ability of others to take a little bit of market share away from them by actually serving other people better. And I think that's the kind of thing that should be exposed. I think would create really good political leverage when you're having those conversations with legislators.
Absolutely. There's an old adage that when legislators decide who can buy and sell, the first thing bought and sold are legislators. And yes. there is at least some anecdotal evidence. Well, at the data level, there's evidence. I mentioned that hospitals that donate to PACs and donate more money to PACs are more likely to obtain their con approval.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also some pretty interesting anecdotal evidence. I know of at least 3 governors in Illinois, Alabama, and Louisiana who have either been accused or have actually done time in jail for selling certificates of need and or certificate of need seats on the board. So
it's not quite as golden as a.
Go ahead,
Matt. It's not quite as golden as a United States Senate seat that Governor Blagojevich was selling, but it is still, maybe it's a little bit of silver, right?
Well, Blagojevich is one of those governors, actually. In addition to selling
the
Senate seat, yeah, he was accused of actually trying to sell a position on the con board, from what I understand.
Right, and that was quite a story as all of that corruption came out. And for those who are not familiar with it, when Barack Obama became the Democratic nominee in 2008, Blagojevich was then governor, is on a wiretap by the Department of Justice, and he refers to the seat appointment to replace Obama as this thing is expletive golden. So he found a lot of things to sell, apparently, or at least attempt to sell. But anyway, the Illinois story is just but one. Remind us again which states, I know you went through this earlier, but we've covered a lot of territory. Remind us which states are the most egregious misbehaving in this regard, and which states are doing a really good job with respect to this.
Yeah. So there are different ways to measure stringency, and to be honest, some of them are easier to measure than others. Probably the easiest thing to measure is just how many types of technologies and procedures does the state require a con for. And on that, Vermont, Hawaii, North Carolina, those states are pretty high up on the list. There are plenty of states, as I mentioned, about 15 that have no con laws whatsoever. That includes California. It includes my state of New Mexico, plenty of others. And then there are some states in between, and there's states that are sort of moving in a good direction. Florida had some really significant con reforms last year, in which they eliminated the con for new hospitals, eliminated the con for hospitals converting to specialty hospitals and vice versa. And they set on a glide path to eliminate about a half a dozen or more other types of cons. West Virginia is moving in a good direction. Alaska, right now, there's legislation moving through the legislature that would eliminate their con. Michigan has, after they overreached, they're actually now scaling back some of their cons. So thankfully, a lot of states are moving in a positive direction on this.
I suppose I'm speculating here, Matt, but it seems it would be helpful if Atlas partners in those states continue to occasionally write about the evolution and the improvements and the actual impact of all these positive reforms that you're talking about, to cement in the public's mind as well as the legislatures and the media's mind that these have been positive improvements and that people are getting better health care and we're having better health care outcomes for people. It would be helpful to have everybody in the network at least addressing this to some degree as it fits into their portfolio.
Absolutely. That would be extraordinarily helpful. And we're willing and happy and willing to work with you on on that in any way we can. We're including, just sharing our data with you and let the local think tank take the credit. We would love to see reforms that have already happened be solidified, and in places where we can move the ball, we want to help that as well.
We have some questions from the audience that we'll get to, some of which you've already addressed, but I'll just rephrase them and tee them up to make sure we properly satisfy those curious questions coming from the audience. Let me ask you one before I do that. Do you have a regular either newsletter or press release system that goes out that people could sign up for to see what kind of things you're working on?
Yeah, and really probably just the easiest way to do that is just to go to mercatus.org, and you can sign up for various newsletters on different topics, everything from healthcare to monetary policy to regulatory favoritism. So, please.
Oh my God, that is sexy stuff. I can't wait to go and get on that list. That's good stuff. So tell us a little bit, you've touched on this, but if you could just sort of put a nice bow tie on it. What have been the biggest obstacles to con reform, and share that with our audience? That was a question from the audience.
Sure, sure. One thing I'd point out is that it's not necessarily a partisan issue. So partisanship hasn't always been an obstacle, and it differs from state to state. If you look at a map, you'll find that the states with some of the most restrictive con laws tend to be in the southeast, tend to be sort of red states. The biggest obstacles are, the incumbent hospitals. And what I would say, maybe what we haven't talked as much about is what's the flip side. What are the greatest opportunities here? Local ambulatory surgery centers are often going to be a really big help in repealing con laws, because these are small, enterprising, entrepreneurial shops, and they're really effective and eager to push back. If you have them also, doctors themselves can be a great resource if you have them organized and they're educated on this issue. In North Carolina, we were down there last year and did a press conference with 20 physicians in lab coats, and they're reading the research. They're interested, and these are scientists, right? They're interested in the data, and they've been convinced that these laws are not effective. So use them when you can.
Awesome. One of the questions we had was how have the con laws affected COVID treatment? But you really covered that earlier. And you covered a little bit about the states that are on the forefront of this. So we've covered a lot of what our audience wanted to know. One of the things I'm curious about that did come from a question from the audience is, what are some of the incrementals? If you can't get the full reform, a complete repeal, what are the incremental steps you do that move us toward the goal?
Yeah. So we had a paper earlier this year that listed, a number of things that you can do. Everything from setting your, full repeal to setting your state on a glide path where you require the con regulator to approve, say, 60% of applications this year, 70% the next year, and then eventually they have to approve 100% and close down their shop. To, there are other types of reforms, transparency reforms that can make it easier. Here, I would recommend that legislators actually enlist the con board to gather data. So they could require the con board to survey anybody who asks for a con to say, hey, what was your compliance cost with this? How much man hours? How much in dollar terms? How much of a hassle was this to try to obtain this con law? And then also to publicize, of course, regularly publicize with the frequency of a con approval, and also how many con applications are opposed by incumbent providers, and then show a crosstab. Show, are you more likely to get your con approved if it was unopposed by an incumbent provider, or less likely? So that kind of, I think, data and transparency can definitely make it easier. And then you can also pick off particularly what I would say is the most nonsensical cons. So again, here I'd start with those that are particularly harmful for vulnerable populations. I mentioned those already. You could also do cons that are really unlikely to be abused. Remember, one of the arguments for con laws is that, we're worried that physicians will overprescribe and they're just going to be doing too many procedures. Well, there's certain cons like hospice care or neonatal intensive care where it's really unlikely that any physician is going to be overprescribing that type of procedure.
Well, I think this is a classic case of addressing the symptom, not the root cause. If you have whether or not there's an expansion of services because of repeal of con, if a doctor is likely to overprescribe, there's an underlying problem that has nothing to do with the con or the expansion of those services. So that's interesting how people put up these straw man arguments in many cases. As you've looked around the country, have you identified some champions in the legislatures of the states, regulators, or the executive branch, people who really have gotten on board with this, got the bit in their mouth and have become really terrific allies? We often criticize people in government, but every now and then we find some people who are really doing exceptional work. Do you have some people you found along the way?
Yeah, I definitely do. I probably won't be able to remember all their names, but I have to say, it's my experience that in almost every state legislature where there is a certificate of need law, there is at least one legislator who is just sort of incensed by these. maybe they know something about the healthcare industry. Maybe they know something just about the process of regulatory capture and how regulators often serve special interests. But you can almost always find one passionate soul. In Alaska, it's Senator Wilson. In Florida, the governor, DeSantis was quite good on this, but I was also the Speaker of the House, Jose Oliva, was a great champion of con reform. In Virginia, there are 2 or 3 state legislators that have been quite passionate about trying to reform these laws. So almost everywhere, I'm glad to say you can find somebody, and I sort of view our role as helping to equip them with the data to make the case that they want to make, and help them refute the cases that the stories that they're encountering from the hospital associations.
Does it help to take those people as testimonial examples to those where you're working and that you don't have people on board yet, in kind of a peer-to-peer way? If a legislator, the Speaker of the House in Florida, is supportive and a good ally, is it helpful to try to at least get a statement from them, or maybe even have them make a phone call to help in Georgia or some other state? Or is that just, how does that work?
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And it's, some of that is something that, again, going back to the sort of happy band of warriors here, Mercatus is one organization, there's plenty of others. I feel like Americans for Prosperity has done a really excellent job getting folks like Jose Oliva to talk to others and reassure them. As you know, legislators are quite risk averse, and they don't want to take a step.
That's an understatement, yeah.
Yeah, they just don't want to change anything. And you can tell them, look, there's this experience of these other states. I think they can often be reassured and be much more willing to take those steps.
We always like to talk, Matt, about how public policy changes people's lives for the better or for the worse. This is amazing work that is changing people's lives for the better, and congratulations to you. Tell us a little bit more about the Equity Initiative more broadly. What is that about, and how it fits into Mercatus's work?
Yeah, so what we're really focused here on is discriminatory public policy. Particularly in this time where we're focused on Black Lives Matter and other types of systemic discrimination, I think it's a really important time to recognize that a whole lot of government public policy is blatantly discriminatory, and it discriminates on lots of different dimensions. We mentioned the fact that con laws have a disparate impact on African Americans. They also have a disparate impact on small providers. They are quite helpful if you're a large operation and you're likely to get a con and you have a lot of connections with the regulators and the legislatures. It's not really a problem for you. So the broader topic here is really about discriminatory policy, about what economists sometimes call rent-seeking behavior or rent-seeking societies, this process where instead of obtaining profits, above normal profits, by figuring out a new and innovative way to please consumers or reduce costs, you obtain above normal profits by figuring out a new and innovative way to please public policymakers, obtain some sort of government-granted privilege that limits your competition, raises the cost of your rivals, forces consumers to buy your product, or some other offers you some sort of privilege in some other way. That's really what we're focused on, and we're actually thinking in terms of trying to ensure that everybody has equal liberty. We talk a lot about equal rights, but an important component of that is those equal natural rights. We should all have the freedom to start our businesses. We should have the freedom to create our own types of business models and enter and compete on our own terms and charge prices that make sense. That's an important value and an important aspect of the American experience in our view.
Yeah, that's crazy talk, Matt. You want people to be able to freely associate and make decisions on their own without some bureaucrat telling them how to live their lives? Wow, you are a radical. So, Matt, tell people how they can get a hold of you and how they can learn more. What's your Twitter handle, share the website, etc.
Yeah, so Matt Mitchell 80 is the Twitter handle. You can find out more at mercatus.org. Please email me mmitchell@mercatus.gmu.edu for story ideas or anecdotes or research ideas. I'd be happy to help in any way I possibly can.
So in the few seconds we have left, Matt, would you like to put a little bow on this? What do you want to tell this very engaged audience that cares about finding better health care for everybody? What do you want them to know? What is the call to action for them?
Yeah, so the call to action is to counter the very loud and very organized voices of the special interests. If you don't stand up and stand up for those who are voiceless and unorganized, really nobody will. But in this instance, and really in so many others, the data is on your side, the science is on your side. Tell the story about how unleashing capitalism, unleashing freedom in the healthcare industry and in other industries can improve lives through greater access, higher quality, and lower cost products and services. This is true in healthcare, and it's true in other walks of life as well.
That's terrific. Matt, thank you so much. Congratulations again on this well-deserved award and the $30,000 to continue this great work. Again, if you want to learn more about Atlas Network and the work that is done here at Atlas, not just in the US and Canada, but all across the world, you can, of course, go to atlasnetwork.org. Once again, we'd like to thank the Templeton Religion Trust for sponsoring the North American Liberty Award. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.